Hello everyone and welcome back to White1 Racing. Today, by popular demand, we'll make a small brief general talk on Piaggio mopeds. The video, as I have told you, will stay generic for various reasons. First of all, the fact that we have little material available, stuff that dates back to many years ago that I had here. If we have the opportunity to get something interesting or particular modifications in our hands, maybe we'll find a way to present them later. Now, since quite a few people have asked us, we'll see some details of the Piaggio moped. The engine is the same one for Ciao, see? Bravo, Boxer, more or less, except for small variations, and also small tricks, what can be done to make it go better, and above all, many structural limitations it has. So in the meantime, here's the crankcase. This is the main cover, and this is the closing cover. Of course, the engine is very small, both because the vehicle is small and because it's just the engine. There is no gearbox. And then there is a space outside for the flywheel and the cooling fan. Now the system is still a rotary valve, like that of the Vespa, only very tiny in comparison. It's therefore less powerful and also less upgradable. I'll show you this detail. This here is a casing of an electronic C. I don't know if you see the valve. This here would even be the big valve, because now I don't have the previous crankcases here on the older vehicles, Ciao and Boxer, which practically only had the oval end of the inlet hole, so even smaller. Therefore, for the same shaft, it has an even tighter phase. Incidentally, the overall phase is more or less between 160-165 degrees, although I can't tell you now the advance and delay. By the way, this here is a standard Piaggio shaft. Many aftermarket were circulating, Mazzucchelli, but also some other brands. I think Gamatron did it too, with a larger facing, or you could just change the original. Must be said that the problems of regurgitation that afflict the Vespa engines, if the intake phase becomes too wide, or on the Piaggio moped are less evident, except when the phase is really exceeded, because being the automatic transmission, an automatic variator, and starting with the engine in torque, those low revs are eliminated, in which an excessively wide intake phase penalizes delivery. So this is the original carburetor, which is a 1212. There was a 1313, which was actually plug and play, except that it was necessary to widen the inlet hole, because this is more or less 12. So if you don't widen the intake, the carburetor from 13, it's of little use indeed. It can do more harm than good. Of course, I am referring to modifications that do not deviate too much from the original engine setup, because there were also relatively powerful modifications, some even a little extravagant. There was certainly a Malossi casing with reed valve intake with 19. There were, and many have been sold, Polini casings, and those made better, especially where the cylinder goes on the crankcase. You see, these here are the original transfers. These are the transfers of the Polini thermal groups. This specifically is a 50 Polini 38.4. However, it's identical in terms of transfers to the 61 and 65, 41 and 43. In reality, the displacement is minor, it's not 65. However, it's not possible to work on the original crankcase and to make it perfectly match the Polini crankcase, or at least you can only go close to the support surface because the casting is extremely thin. So the crankcase gets punctured immediately. Not only that, there were also thermal groups of larger displacement. Even several 75 were made. But even there, in the original crankcases, the crankcase had to be enlarged. Then it went into rectification and made it widen. But on the original crankcase it's dangerous because the crankcase is thin, so then it becomes weak where they keep the stud bolts. This is another plus point of the Polini crankcases, which were thicker. And by the way, they already had the marks for the third transfer, depending on which cylinder you had to put on. They made several good aluminium cylinders. There was Simonini, Pinasco, even Polini made one that had a removable exhaust pipe. There have been several, maybe even Simonini with a larger exhaust with a 28 manifold. Anyway, I'm saying this, generally speaking, on these mopeds, always save the constant and never sufficiently stressed question of regularity on the streets. So in reality, the vehicle must circulate as it left the factory. However, the small modifications are profitable on these engines. The more powerful ones create an enormous amount of problems because the structure of the vehicle is not adequate. And I am referring in particular to the swing arm, which with powerful engines tend to spoil itself. And among other things, the crankshaft may not be original, it may be as good as you want, but you see, this is an extremely important fact. The main bearing is on this side. Then there is the flywheel that is crowned here. Then there is the variator and the belt, depending on the shifting progression and how open the front half pulley is. It moves more or less at this point, so it works with a tremendous lever arm relative to the bearing. This is already an element of great weakness. Among other things, the original Piaggio fitted the flywheel side bearing with increased tolerance. It's a C3, and the one on the other side a C2. Moreover, those who have the Ciao know this well. This bearing, even if it's less stressed, it got ruined because it was filled with dirt. So much so that some shafts, there was a Pinasco with round flyer and counterweights. Cleverly, I have to say, it had this axle grid to allow the gas to circulate and allow the bearing to be lapped with, by the fresh mixture. So far I have referred to modifications more or less distant from the original. Then lately there have been many special pieces, fantastic crankcases, things that completely changed the vehicle. They certainly have excellent performance. There remains the structural limit of the SI swing arm and of the tilting swing arms in general. The Ciao is a bit of a different matter because it's fixed, but that is a structural weakness that exists if it's not remedied in another way. The important difference to keep in mind between the heads: this here would be the head of the Ciao and Boxer, and this here of the SI. It goes without saying that the SI head has a much higher radiating surface, so where possible, or even with slight modification, it's good to put the head of the SI. Use these here rather than the small ones because the cooling changes. And another very important thing, now I don't have here to show it to you, but who has a C should know that on this part of the cylinder there is a casing that conveys the air. Because the fan blows here, the air goes round and goes round because the fan cover ends as well as my hand. Then there is another plastic casing fixed with a metal clip on which a screw is screwed in, which closes the cylinder up to this point, which is of vital importance. On many mopeds it's missing or was missing. I'm older now. These are memories of the youth, but it was always missing. It's an excellent opportunity to go out to goal because the whole rear part of the cylinder is not cooled. And this you see is an aluminum cylinder, the Pinasco 75, and this is the clip that holds the crankcase. Another important issue concerns the advance. So this is an electronic crankcase. As you can see, there are no button holes, so the advance is fixed and cannot be adjusted. On those with points there was a minimal possibility of adjustment due to the opening of the points. Adjusting the points a little closer delays and adjusting them more open anticipates. But in short, it's more effort than it's worth. Another way was to move the flywheel to change the advance. In fact, misaligned keys were on the market. Of course, even there, one took a little bit of what was on the market. Here, these are two small parts of the crankcase compared. One refined and one which isn't. On the unworked one, which would be this one, you can see the signs of the lacquers where the transfer of the Polini cylinder doesn't copy on the crankcase. You see what shape? Even if it's worked, this worked one is it's wider. You see, there's a part that remains outside. That is, the Polini cylinder doesn't copy all the original transfer. There is tip that remains outside, and in addition it's throttled in other points. The DR modifications had a triangle that copied, so even a bit like on the less performing Vespa, but more adaptable plug and play. Of course, this applies to Piaggio mopeds, but it also applies to any scooter. A very important element of the elaboration is the care of the transmission. Because the transmission, and here I only consider the one with the variator because the fixed ratio is not suitable, manages the shifting progression. Hence the infinite sequence of ratios within a certain range that adapt the transmission to the needs of the engine. And therefore, depending on the output curve of the engine, it will be necessary to choose an adequate balance between the weight of the centrifugal masses in the front pulley and the calibration, the hardness of the contra spring. Clearly, these forces must establish an equilibrium that maintains the engine from the moment you start until reaching maximum speed, always in a range of revolutions higher than that of maximum torque. Between maximum torque and maximum power, only here has to work. Now, the more powerful the engine, the more the belt must be stretched, otherwise it'll slide, and the greater the forces that play between the front pulley that wants to open and the rear pulley that tends to close must be higher. For this reason, it's necessary to use very hard springs at the rear and also compensate a little with weight of the more or less heavy rollers, but in any case, such as to force a more robust spring. And it's precisely the necessary presence of greater forces at play that puts a strain on the transmission itself and the crankshaft and bearings. If you liked this video, leave a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Remember, White One Racing is not a workshop, but an amateur sport association that works on engines only for sport purposes and only for its associates.